Okay, so the next topic is managing protected areas. So we've designed them. We've tried to have effective corridors. The next thing we need to do is once we have the protected area, what do we need to do to make sure we continue to maintain biodiversity through time? A lot of people in the past have used the kind of nature knows best idea and have completely left protected areas alone and not done a lot of management. However, because of human modifications in the past or historic disturbances, things like that, management may be really necessary to maintain biodiversity. A lot of parks exist only on paper, and others are carefully managed with detailed management plans. So there's a wide variety of management practices for protected areas. And a large part of management can be making the public aware of rules and enforcing them. And wildlife managers, a lot of people think, oh, I want to be a wildlife manager, I want to work with wildlife. But a lot of times wildlife managers spend almost as much time or most of their time managing people and not wildlife. And if you talk to managers of different natural areas, like for Red River National Wildlife Refuge or Black Bayou National Wildlife Refuge that are kind of in our areas, they spend a lot of time making sure people follow the rules and managing people much more than they do managing wildlife. So here are some examples of people not being managed well. So trash can be a huge problem for wildlife because a lot of times they'll sniff it out if it had food waste in it, and we don't want our wildlife to associate people and food. Quite a while ago, so back in like the 1950s, it was common to feed the wildlife, and that wasn't necessarily prohibited in some places. Sometimes there are rules and people just don't follow them. So you can see these people have gone beyond the stay behind railing. There's a lot of expensive equipment and personnel spent when people don't follow safety rules, having to helicopter people out of national parks. Things like that is a very expensive portion of running parks. And then there are a lot of people that make very unsafe decisions, like you should not take a selfie with a large bison. It's a huge wildlife species that can kill a person. So again, managing people is often a really big part of this. So that's why there are often signs everywhere to make sure people are aware of the different rules. Sometimes there are areas that people aren't allowed in, especially if there are ground nesting birds that are endangered or something like that. It may not be safe to be in certain areas. So you can see animals are dangerous, never approach or feed. And then a lot of times they have information about fire danger because we don't want to accidentally set fires in our protected areas if they're not supposed to be there. So managing protected areas in areas where people have lived for a very long time, sometimes human activities promote biodiversity. And maintaining these types of activities can be important so that we can have as much biodiversity as possible. Also, having a management plan doesn't mean it's a good management plan. So if we just look at protected areas and whether or not they have a management plan, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best. So some are managed for abundant deer with predator removal so that there can be more opportunities to hunt. But to maintain biodiversity, we really want those predators there. If you'll remember back to the Yellowstone example, having wolves there was really important for managing the whole ecosystem. Some managers also remove snags and down logs to make it look prettier, but those can be really important features of different ecosystems for nesting birds, for woodpeckers, and for a variety of wildlife that might use them as some kind of shelter. So here are some examples. I used to work at Poquoson Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. It is the wintering ground for about half the tundra swans in the world. And I used to help band the tundra swans, but there are large expanses that are just cultivated corn for these birds, which helps feed them, but it is not perhaps the best way to maintain biodiversity. This shows the use of some of the snags that sometimes managers will remove to improve appearance, but we can see that they're being used by wildlife and are actually really important features of ecosystems. So management can be necessary to maintain historic disturbance regimes. So disturbance isn't always bad. Sometimes disturbance is necessary to maintain certain specific ecosystem types. And a good example of this is fire. And so people have suppressed fire for a long time, thinking that fire is bad. And huge wildfires certainly are bad for biodiversity. However, smaller fires, if we keep them completely out, it can change totally what kind of ecosystem we have in a particular place. Similarly, with flood regimes, we don't want our houses or neighborhoods or cities to flood. However, some ecosystems flood naturally, and that's part of maintaining the biodiversity and the normal ecosystem function. Grazing can also be a type of disturbance that is historic in certain areas. So, like our prairies evolved with grazing from bison and elk and other types of animals. And so, if we take those out of the equation, then that might change the biodiversity of the plants that live in that area. Also, we need to think about how do we control invasive species. Sometimes these disturbance regimes help keep invasive species out or help suppress invasive species because the invasive species may not be adapted to these disturbance regimes that the other native wildlife and native plants may be adapted to. Without these disturbance regimes, the areas will undergo succession, which means they will develop into a different ecosystem. And if we're trying to preserve all different types of ecosystems, then we may need to make sure these disturbance regimes are in place so that we can keep all of our different types of ecosystems. So this shows an example with grazing. So this is tallgrass prairie, which is a very endangered type of ecosystem that used to be across the Midwest of the United States. And you can see that the number of plants through time stays low if the prairie is completely ungrazed. The best thing to do is to have bison. And that's what these prairies evolved with large populations of free-ranging bison. Now, obviously, we don't have free-ranging bison anymore, but what they found is that although cattle are not native to these prairies, they can perform a similar function that the bison do. So the biodiversity of the plants isn't as high if we have cattle instead of bison, but it's still greatly better than if we have no grazing at all. And so using cattle may, at the right densities, you don't want to overload the prairie, but at the right densities, cattle can actually improve biodiversity because it's maintaining this disturbance regime of grazing in our native prairies. Another big example, as I mentioned, is fire suppression. If we don't have small fires, we get the buildup of fuels. We get dead trees, lots of downed wood. Some of it is good, but in some places, too much of that can lead to very large wildfires. And we've been seeing that in California, we've seen it in Australia. And when you combine that with climate change, with these severe droughts, these large wildfires become more and more frequent. We also lose fire-dependent species if we suppress fire. So the way to fix this is using prescribed fire. And we do have a class here in the forestry department about prescribed fire. So if you're interested in that, I really encourage you to take that class. But the idea is that we prescribe fire, just like you would prescribe a medicine for someone sick. We're prescribing these sick ecosystems with fire to maintain fire-dependent communities, prevent large wildfires, And people that do prescribed fires get very thorough training on how to do it and under what conditions. And there are slightly different guidelines depending on what type of ecosystem you're in. Are you doing prescribed fire in forests? Are you doing it in grasslands? Are you doing it in areas with wetlands? Those may have slightly different guidelines, and you have to manage the weather conditions very closely when you're doing prescribed fire. So this shows an example. This is a grassland that is mostly invasive grasses before burning. When you burn it, it often looks really bad right away. It's black, charred earth, and a lot of times the public is like, what are you doing to the protected area? So some education is often necessary about why burning is important. But you can see 9 months post the burn, the grasses are back. There's higher biodiversity in here than there was. It has suppressed the invasive grass, and it's a much, much improved ecosystem. This shows some other examples. This is what a prescribed fire looked like in this grassland, in this prairie. And these are some of the results. The increased biodiversity. Some species will only go to seed or only sprout when they've been burned. And so these fires can be really important to save certain endangered species. It sounds a little counterintuitive if you're not used to knowing about burning, which a lot of the public doesn't really know much about prescribed burns, but they can be essential for some species. So I want to talk about a couple of examples of ecosystems that are near us. So this is longleaf pine. So this green area shows the historic range of longleaf pine. It's been reduced to a very, very tiny proportion of this. But longleaf pine trees are actually fire dependent. And so they need fire to germinate their seeds. And they have this kind of grassy stage where the seedlings do just fine after they've been burned. They resprout right away after they've been burned. And it's what helps them deal with frequent fires, whereas other trees, their young can't deal with these fires. So the seedling trees get burned up and they don't come back. And that's part of what maintains the longleaf pine forests is things like loblolly pine get burned up when the fire comes through, but the young longleaf pines recover relatively quickly. So you can see 5 weeks after the burn, it's green again. Shortleaf pine is another pine forest type that is very fire dependent. And shortleaf pine is what should be on tops of the hills all over the Ruston area. It is also a very endangered ecosystem, similar to longleaf pine. It is supposed to be in all the upland areas in northern Louisiana, Arkansas, and all the way up through Missouri. It requires frequent fire, so every few years, historically, a fire would come through. And their seedlings, similar to the longleaf pine, are also adapted to dealing with fire. And shortleaf pine have this interesting crook. So when they grow up, but then they have this curve in their seedling. And when the fire comes through, it burns off the top of the seedling, but part of the place where it grows from is buried underground and it's protected. So when the fire comes through, loblolly pine gets burned up, but these shortleaf pines have an advantage because the tops of them get burned up, but the rest of them are fine, and so they can resprout right away, just like the longleaf pine can. And that's what makes them so fire tolerant, but they are outcompeted by other species if these fires don't come through. So that's what helps maintain these longleaf and shortleaf pine forests. And there is active restoration for shortleaf pine going on just outside of Ruston with a Nature Conservancy conservation easement. And some of you may have been to the property Wafer Creek Ranch for some of your other classes, but it's a very important shortleaf pine restoration site. This shows a diagram about prescribed burning. I said that you have to take special training to be able to do prescribed burns. You have to plan it. You have to know a lot about the weather. You need particular humidity, temperatures. You need to know a lot about the wind direction. And you need to know where all your fire breaks are. So things like a road makes a good fire break. There may be water, that's a natural fire break. Sometimes they'll build forest roads in to act as other fire breaks, and that's because you want to contain your fire to a particular area. You don't want it to get out of hand and start burning other places that you won't be able to contain it. So they will, there's lots of different roles in a prescribed fire, and I don't expect you to know all of these, but you can see there are people going through. This is an igniter. This guy's got a drip torch, and he's basically setting things on fire. Sometimes, depending on the type of landscape, they may drop antifreeze in ping pong balls to start fires in remote areas that somebody can't walk into, and they'll have the igniters going around the periphery. So it depends on the type of ecosystem, how exactly you implement the prescribed burn. Some people call them controlled burns, but a fire expert will tell you there are no controlled burns because fire is hard to predict. And so you can do your best to control it, but a fire is never truly controlled, but it is prescribed. It's something that's applied to help increase the biodiversity and meet your conservation goals.